During Nixon's famous trip to Moscow in 1959, he was potentially exposed to radiation. In fact, members of the Secret Service believed he had been targeted.
You can't just drop the fact that the Soviets tried to kill Nixon with radiation in the middle of a video and then move on, all right? I googled it. Here we go. During the Cold War, it was known to the US State Department that the American embassy in Moscow was being constantly bombarded with microwave radiation. And during a trip to Moscow in 1959, then Vice President Nixon may have been intentionally targeted with very high doses of ionizing radiation. The first part sounds an awful lot like Havana syndrome, but it was actually first reported back in 1967 and has been confirmed with testing equipment. In 1967, after reports from embassy staff, the State Department did not detect elevated levels of radiation in the US Embassy in Moscow, but measurable levels of microwave radiation had climbed so high by 1975 that President Ford wrote a letter to the Soviet premier asking him to do something about it, even implying that Ambassador Walter Stossel's leukemia might be linked. This information was never given to embassy staff. Before a 1975 visit, Henry Kissinger made an official request that the beam be turned off, but that might be a joke. Soviet Premier Brezhnev insisted that the radiation was coming from industrial sources, although others theorized the intention was either to signal the Soviets' own listening devices inside the buildings, or potentially neutralizing any spy equipment that the Americans might have been using inside. After being built by Russian contractors, the Americans found so many listening devices built into the embassy that they had to demolish and then rebuild the top 2 floors. When Nixon visited Moscow in 1959, he and his wife were put up in the ambassador's residence. The Secret Service had noticed that Soviet representatives, when they were visiting the States, had started bringing Geiger counters with them. The Secret Service asked Nixon if he'd like to include those for his trip as well, but he thought that might be a little insulting. He approved less conspicuous radiation dosimeters instead. Almost immediately, the Secret Service detected ionizing radiation and realized that everyone in the building was receiving what the State Department described as a massive dose. The State Department told the Secret Service that it was likely an atomic battery powering some sort of Soviet listening device, but the Secret Service was not convinced. The 1959 incident was first reported publicly by a Secret Service agent, James Golden, in 1976, but 2022 was when the documentation was first made available. Even Nixon had been unaware of the incident until Golden told him in 1976. The dosimeters in the residence were reading 15 Röntgen per hour, with industrial safety standards limiting people to 5 Röntgen per year. On the first evening of the visit, radiation levels had climbed so rapidly that a former Navy nuclear engineer on the Secret Service detail was convinced there had been a nuclear disaster somewhere nearby. In order to get the Russians to stop, the Secret Service staged a very loud argument about it inside the residence, knowing it would be picked up by Soviet surveillance equipment. Golden notes that just after the shouting match, the radiation ceased.